Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing an audiobook that I listened to. It is Medieval Horizons: Why the Middle Ages Matter by Ian Mortimer, and it was read by the author. So I listened to the audiobook over the course of a couple days, and now I want to talk about what the contents of this book are, some connections I found with other books that I've read, and give you an opportunity to decide if this is a book that you would like to read or that you are interested in. And at any point during this video, if you have comments, thoughts, or different ideas, feel free to share them in the comment section down below. I love to receive your comments, and I like being able to read and get more information from other people who may have more knowledge on the topic than I do. So let's dive in. Ian Mortimer starts this book by saying that many of us have a perception of the Middle Ages which isn't correct, which is that it was a dark, backwards time that was more or less unchanging. And the unchanging aspect is the time that he talks about. It is true there were some technologies that were lost, and there's also this knowledge that things went to the Arab world to be preserved that were not necessarily preserved in the European Middle Ages. But the idea that everything just stayed the same throughout the Middle Ages is not correct. And there's this idea that if you took a peasant from 1000 and then moved him to year 1600, there wouldn't be too much of a difference. That if you moved a peasant throughout the different time frames of the Middle Ages, it would be more or less unchanging and the peasant wouldn't notice a difference. Well, if you took a medieval peasant and moved them to modern times, there would be a slew of differences indicating that there was very little change during the Middle Ages, but a lot of change in more recent times or through maybe after the Middle Ages or the 1800s, wherever you think all the massive changes took place in. But Ian Mortimer says, no, this is not correct, and there's a lot of changes even from earlier in the Middle Ages to later in the Middle Ages. And this is where the subtitle comes in, Why the Middle Ages Matter. So all the things that changed throughout the Middle Ages that had impacts later on. This actually ties in with another book that I listened to back in like 2021 or 2022 called The Bright Ages, which turns the idea of the Dark Ages on its head and says there was a lot of creativity and a lot of intellectual things going on in the Middle Ages that maybe we're not as familiar with due to this idea of the Dark Ages or being stagnant or no progress being made during the Middle Ages. Now, Ian Mortimer is an English historian, so he does self-admittedly select most of his examples from England, although he does admit that England was existing on the periphery of medieval life in Europe, and there was a lot going on the continent. But he says if you were a German historian or a French historian, you could just select examples from your area as well. So he's just working with what he knows, understanding that there's plenty of examples on the continent and that his examples are necessarily limited to his knowledge. He doesn't just select examples from England, but it does tend to focus, and a lot of the dates he talks about are based in England. So just keep that in mind. He starts off by talking about a lot of the technological changes that occurred during the Middle Ages. So he talks about printing. That is a massive one, and that ties in with one of our horizons that we talk about later. So we have printing, which obviously changed the game. Most of us can think of that. Most of us would also think of the advances in things like gunpowder, guns, that changes war significantly. Magnets, the shift from vellum to paper was big, and some changes in science, this movement away from Aristotle, understanding, especially after 1492, Columbus discovers for Europe, he finds that there are these two continents that Aristotle had nothing to say about. So maybe if Aristotle was wrong about some things, he might be wrong about other things. Another example of this is the heliocentrism and maybe changes to how we view the universe and the Earth's role in the universe. And a change in the legal system as we shift away from local justice just being dealt with at a local level to a more centralized legal system where there are things like courts and a more central dispensation of justice. He then is going to go into 6 different horizons or 6 different areas where he's going to focus in significantly and talk about changes that occurred. And the horizons that he's talking about, or these topics that he's covering, are war, inequality, comfort, speed, literacy, and individualism. So I'm going to go through each one of these and kind of explain some of the key takeaways that I took away, understanding that this is a very long audiobook. It's 14 hours, I want to say. So I'm not covering every single example and every single topic, and you can listen to this audiobook yourself if you would like to learn about more in detail about each of these chapters. So the first he goes to, the first horizon that he's going to talk about where a lot changed throughout the Middle Ages is war, and that comes with the advance of guns and gunpowder that changes war significantly. Where earlier war was very close and personal, war became more at a distance. So you had things like cannons and guns where you can kill someone from a far distance, which changes the nature of war in general. You don't have to look at the person you're killing necessarily exactly. We had things like arrows before, and not everyone was killed up close and personal, but throughout the Middle Ages there was a waning of the importance of things like knights and castles as these became less important in warfare. And we think of knights and castles as being a key part of the Middle Ages, but a peasant who was living, or just someone from the Middle Ages who was living when knights and castles were very relevant to warfare, they were moved a couple hundred years later ahead in history. Even if you were still within the Middle Ages, you would find that those importances had decreased. Also throughout the Middle Ages, there is a decline on the emphasis on crusading. I'm actually dealing with this in the audiobook I'm listening to right now called A Distant Mirror, which is about the 14th century. And in that book too, which I'm not doing a book review, well, I am doing a book review, but not doing it right now. Basically, she also mentions that crusading became more of something you did to more of lip service that you paid throughout the Middle Ages. So there was a decline on the importance of crusading, and there became an increased recognition on the economic prosperity of peace. Why fight with your neighbor when you can trade with your neighbor and make money and less people die? So war and the importance of war and who you were fighting with and what you were fighting with changed significantly throughout the Middle Ages. Next up was inequality. This was a pretty dark chapter, and he starts off by saying that historical fiction that we read usually glosses over a lot of the inequalities that were experienced, particularly with women. So it's not fun to read a historical fiction book where women have zero agency in their lives, and some women could exert some level of control over their life depending on power or position, but a lot of women and a lot of people who weren't women, a lot of people in general just didn't have a lot of agency in their life in the Middle Ages, but this changed throughout the Middle Ages. So he also talks a lot about how when we look backwards, we bring with us like our moral framework, and we think one of the examples he gives is how could anyone sell their own child into slavery, and he talks about in the idea of someone from that age might feel like they've been given no choice. Maybe their child starves to death, but maybe by selling the child into slavery, they can guarantee their child has a place to stay, food, and clothing. So he talks a lot about some of these difficult decisions that we looking outside in might not understand, but by just dismissing everything, we don't understand the medieval perspective. So we do have to dig into some of these more uncomfortable things, like the horrible things that would happen to women or to slaves in this era, to kind of understand the mindset of the time, because things were highly, highly unequal, although things did shift throughout the Middle Ages. So that was kind of a dark chapter to read and to get through. Next was comfort. This is one that I just found intriguing. The way that houses were designed improved, so you had less like smoke in the area, and you could divide up plots of land and build better houses. There's a lot of talk about things like mattresses and how people slept, and the one thing that I took away was earlier in the Middle Ages, pillows were not truly a thing. In fact, pillows were really only reserved for women in childbirth. That's kind of the only time you could have that comfort, which was little comfort compared to the fact that you were in childbirth. I feel like I have bigger fish to fry if I were giving birth. I have never had a kid, but I feel like pillows would, I don't know how much of a difference they would make. But I guess they afforded women that luxury when giving birth. But in the later Middle Ages, pillows and things like mattresses became a lot more common and more people had access to them. So a level of comfort in life definitely improved. And someone, again, our fictional person who's being transported along the timeline in the Middle Ages finds an increase in comfort, which I guess is a good thing for him. I would assume is a good thing for him. The next item that the author covers is speed. So he talks about the relay of messages and how that compared particularly with the Romans and the Mongols, who both also had their own trade lines and conversation and mail and ways of getting messages around. So it's not new that we had these ways to relay messages, but he talks about ways that things could be improved and the way things did improve in the Middle Ages. The key takeaway from the speed chapter for me was the faster you could get a message from a central government out to people who were under you, the more you consolidated your central power. And so by speeding up the way messages and news traveled throughout a kingdom, it centralized power in one area, and it decreased the importance of the local government lords, whoever was ruling. which, having read some stuff from around the Norman Conquest, I've read some books like on the Battle of Hastings, on Ethelred the Unready, The First Kingdom by Max Adams, which talks a lot about some of the earlier times in, for lack of a better term, British history. And you see a lot more that there may be a king, but there's a lot of other local government, nobles, lords, royals, thanes, who are able to have a lot of power, but the power becomes more centralized, and some of this, argued by Ian Mortimer, is by increasing the way you can get news and enforce your commands and relay messages, you can centralize your power. Although I am very sure there are many, many other things that contributed to a decrease of territorial or local power as well. So that was the speed. Next came into my favorite section, the section that I absolutely loved and that I really enjoyed. I think this was the best section for me, and this was the literacy section. So the key player in literacy is the vernacular Bible, and the Bible was one of the most popular books to read still. If I had to imagine, it's probably one of the most printed books still, but it especially was in the medieval European world. People wanted to read the Bible. And the translation of the Bible into the vernacular, here English, because Ian Mortimer, English historian, was a massive, massive turning point. We see, for example, a connection between having a Bible in the vernacular and the strength of a Reformation, which was a massive, massive watershed moment for Europe in general and world history. The decrease in power, or the decrease in the absolute control of the Catholic Church over Europe. And by areas that have a vernacular Bible had stronger reformations. For example, there was a vernacular German Bible, and Germany was one of those places that had a strong Reformation presence. And some of that, I would have to imagine, was contributed to the fact that Martin Luther kicked off the Reformation there. But we see other areas that didn't have a vernacular Bible, didn't have as strong of a Reformation presence, and by having a vernacular Bible and giving the lay people access, so kind of removing this Latin requirement, or this requirement to learn other languages to read the scripture, led people directly read something. So you no longer had this gatekeeping of the clergy to understanding the scripture that led the religion that really formed your life. You could access it directly. And from that, you could start to question things like, why does the church have so much power? I'm not seeing a basis for this in scripture. And that leads to many changes and many reformations that occurred, which had massive impacts in history. So I think the vernacular Bible was really a key player, and Ian Mortimer really explains that very, very well. Ian Mortimer also talks about how memorization played a big role in memory up until we had printing and increases in printing and better printing methods. And this is a topic that I want to explore maybe in some other books that I can get out. The role that memory played in human learning and the importance of memory has definitely decreased in human civilization with our access to things like printing, for example. Just printing changed that in the Middle Ages when Europe got access to printing. But also things now like our smartphones decrease the amount that we have to retain in memory, and that has to have implications, good, bad, neutral, I don't know, but I know there are books written about that, and I would love if you have recommendations to let me know what those are, because the change in how much memorization was required was changed by printing, and that had impacts. And we will get back to that in a second because it ties into something later. So the vernacular Bible also increased literacy massively, and he being the author, explains that, for example, in Portugal, where there was no vernacular Bible for a long, long time, literacy rates stayed very low for hundreds of years past the Middle Ages. While in England, once we had the development of the vernacular Bible, there is a large increase in literacy because people want to read the Bible, and now they don't have to understand Latin to read the Bible. They just have to learn how to read in their native language. And this is important because this is an important change, because reading isn't a hardwired function of the human brain. So any human, if they are born into an area with other humans and they don't have some sort of impairment like hard of hearing or some other neurological issue, will learn how to speak. Speaking is hardwired into humans. You speak to babies and you interact with babies, but babies naturally are hardwired to speak. A human who doesn't learn how to speak has some sort of impairment going on, or something socially happened. There was a problem, essentially. If someone doesn't learn how to read, that doesn't indicate any sort of issue or problem biologically or with the social environment the child was raised in. Reading is not hardwired. And so when we have this increase in literacy, this is something that didn't have to happen, but it does, and that has massive impacts. And I think this ties in also with memorization, because if we think about writing had to be invented in a way that speaking doesn't have to be invented. But writing was invented, and this comes from a lot of my reading from like Mesopotamia, was essentially invented as a memorization aid. So we kind of see this line of memorization flowing through this chapter, where when we have printing on paper and printing becomes a lot more accessible, it's not scribes hand copying, memorization and the importance of memorization decreases. But writing came about as essentially a memory aid. When we had these groups of people that were developing civilization in Mesopotamia, there became an increase in economic activity, and writing became important because you couldn't remember how many sheep were sold to the temple and how much grain was taxed. And that's where writing came from, as basically an economic shorthand to aid memorization. And so you don't have to rely on human memory so much. You have written records. So writing came about to aid memory, and kind of, once we had so much that we couldn't memorize all of it, we needed writing. And now with an increase of printing, memorization decreases even more, and more people become literate because they now have the opportunity, particularly through a vernacular Bible. So there's also a very strong interest in this literacy chapter on the dividing line in where English is understood. So as a modern speaker of English, anything that comes after the 1500s, we can usually comprehend with some struggle, but it's comprehensible. We can read Shakespeare, and there may be words that we need to understand or something we need to have explained to us, but a lot of it is very similar. And pre-1500s, that is not the case. If you have looked at anything from 1200s, 1100s, it is a very different language. And so the 1500s are really a turning point in which the rate of change in language has slowed down, and English became a lot more standardized. And this is because, again, the vernacular Bible. So when Tyndale printed his Bible, the rhythm he used, the speaking he used, also things like the King James Bible, which referenced Tyndale, that became standard in English, and that has led to us being able to understand things, with changes granted, but understand things from the 1500s on. This, to me, reminded me also of Dante and Dante's publishing, which led to the standardization of Italian and the form that is used today. So this is something that has happened again and again, and it comes from publishing a book in the vernacular, and that's where that comes from. So that section, for me, the literacy section, was my favorite, as you can tell from how much I spoke about it, and I could just learn about this for days, I feel like. So I liked the literacy section. But there's one more section that the author talked about, and that is individualism. Throughout the Middle Ages, people started to separate themselves into smaller and smaller groups. So initially there was just this level where you had priests and a workforce at the bottom. So just two groups. You were either working as a laborer or you're a priest, and you both worked to support the decision-making warrior class, which was up at top. And there was high clergy, which kind of were outside the warriors, who were kind of making the rules of the game, Mortimer explains, but that was kind of your basic stratification. You were either supporting the warriors and the decision makers, or you were the warriors and decision makers. But as the Middle Ages went on, people began to separate themselves out by things like their occupation. And after the 1400s, by their hereditary last name. And you began to associate with a smaller and smaller group and have more of an individual idea of who you were. Now, another concept that developed during the Middle Ages that played a big role was purgatory and what happened to you after death. So with purgatory, there is this idea that people could pray to speed up your time in purgatory. So basically, you had to pay some penance for things that occurred during your lifetime. So before you got to go to heaven, you had to spend some time in purgatory. So it's this in-between place between hell, which the really bad sinners were going to go to, and heaven. So you had to spend some time in purgatory. But that could be sped up by people praying for you or praying for your soul after death. So people became concerned with being remembered after death. And we have an increase in things like paying for masses to be said after you die, and paying for art to be put in churches as like a bequest, or to remember your soul, or to indicate how pious you were. And this was actually seen in another book that I read, Glass Painters, and this is part of my Medieval Craftsman series, and the review for that is also on my channel, where there's different glass like windows that are built that are put in memory or to remind people how pious someone was during life. And that comes from this increase in individualism and concern about how you were perceived both in life and after death. Also, the mirror, which was an invention that had been lost after antiquity, but did exist in antiquity, was rediscovered, and this leads to a change in art and some art that focused on the self-portrait. An example of this was Jan van Eyck's portrait. It was called like a man with a turban, I think is what the title is, but we see self-portraits, which really, before the mirror, you wouldn't know too much about how you looked on a day-to-day basis, which is a massive change from today, where you probably have looked at the mirror today. I looked at the mirror before when I got out of bed, when I finished getting ready for work, before I joined a Teams meeting. From my job, I checked the little review box to see how I look. I looked in the mirror before I sat down to film. So we are always looking in the mirror today, and to go many, many years of your life without seeing unless you saw your reflection in some water, you would not have a day-to-day basis of how you looked to yourself. You just have your own internal idea. And so the mirror also really, really changed things, and its rediscovery during the Middle Ages had a big role on individualism. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I also like the way the narrator read it. I like Ian Mortimer's writing style. I liked the way he presented topics, and as you can tell, I like the literacy section a lot, and it gives me ideas of future readings that I want to do. It's very, very enjoyable, and it makes me want to read more of Ian Mortimer's writing because I think he has a really good natural way of writing that just works for me, and that kept me interested and engaged in the topic throughout the entire audiobook. I also liked the connections to other books that I read, like The Bright Ages and Glass Painters, because those were I can see connections to other books that I've read, and I really like that. I like making connections in my head and saying, oh, that reminds me of that book, as I kind of create in my head this like web of concepts that relate to each other when I read a book like this. So I highly recommend, if you're looking for an overview of things that changed throughout the Middle Ages, Medieval Horizons by Ian Mortimer might be a book you want to check out. And if you have any thoughts or comments on this book, please leave it in the comment section down below. I love to receive your thoughts and comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I